There is a way of being in this world that carries no announcement, no declaration, no claim to light. It moves through the noise of human existence like wind through an empty field, unseen yet undeniable. You have perhaps felt it in the presence of certain souls, though you could not name what stirred within you when they passed. They do not speak of their awakening. They do not wear it as a crown or carry it as a banner before them, and yet something in their silence makes the loudest voices seem suddenly hollow. Let me speak of those who have crossed into a different country of the soul, not because they sought it, but because life demanded it of them. They are not better than those who sleep. They are not wiser in the way the world measures wisdom. They have simply paid a price that cannot be refunded, and in that payment something shifted in the architecture of their being. You will not find them preaching in the streets or gathering followers to their cause. You will find them
in the quiet margins, watching the theater of human striving with eyes that remember something the performers have forgotten. The truly awake do not argue with the dreaming. They have learned that truth cannot be transferred like coins from one hand to another. They have discovered that the sleeping must sleep until their own night demands they rise, and no amount of shaking will hasten what must arrive in its own season. This is why they seem distant sometimes, removed, as if standing on a shore while others thrash in waves they no longer feel compelled to fight. It is not indifference you see in them. It is the exhaustion of having once believed that words could wake what only experience can stir. There was a time when they too tried to save the world, to rescue the drowning, to shake the sleepers from their dreams. There was a time when they believed their seeing gave them the duty to make others see, and they learned, slowly and with great sorrow, that awakening is not a gift one soul can give another. It is a private devastation that visits each in solitude, stripping away what was never real until only what cannot be destroyed remains. The truly awake have stopped trying to convince anyone of anything. They have realized that their presence is their only authentic testimony, and even that will be misunderstood by most who encounter it. Watch how they listen. The awake listen differently than those still caught in the machinery of self. When you speak to them, you will notice they are not preparing their response while you talk. They are not waiting for the gap in your words where they can insert their own. They are present to what you are saying in a way that feels almost uncomfortable, as if they can hear not just your words, but the sorrow beneath them, the longing behind them, the lifetime of conditioning that shaped them. This listening is not a technique they learned. It is what remains when the need to defend, to prove, to position oneself has finally been burned away. They do not fill silence with noise. In a world that cannot bear the weight of quiet, they have made peace with the emptiness that terrifies others. Sit with them in a room and you will notice how comfortable they are with pauses, with gaps in conversation, with the space between words that most rush to fill with chatter. They have discovered that truth lives in these silences more often than in the cascade of language we use to avoid it. They are not avoiding connection through their quiet. They have simply learned that not everything needs to be said, that presence can speak louder than words, and that sometimes the kindest thing you can offer another is the dignity of silence. Notice how they respond to conflict. The truly awake do not engage in the same battles that consume the sleeping. They have lost their taste for being right, for winning arguments, for proving points. When confronted with aggression or judgment, they do not rise to meet it with matching force. This is not weakness or passivity. This is the deep knowing that everyone is fighting a war you cannot see, and that beneath all human conflict lies the same wound dressed in different costumes. They have been to the bottom of their own darkness and found they're not the monsters they expected, but simply pain dressed as protection. So when they encounter darkness in others, they recognize it as familiar territory rather than enemy land. They carry a peculiar relationship with suffering. While others still believe that pain is something to be fixed, avoided, or transcended as quickly as possible, the awake have learned that suffering is often the very doorway through which truth enters. They do not seek it, they do not romanticize it, but neither do they run from it with the desperation that characterizes those still hoping for a life free from discomfort. They have discovered that the things which break us are often the very things that make us whole, that the wounds we try to
Hide are precisely where the light gets in. This is why they do not rush to comfort you with false hope when you are in pain. They sit with your suffering instead, honoring it as sacred work rather than a problem to be solved. You will recognize them by what no longer moves them. The truly awake are not impressed by the things that captivate the sleeping world. Wealth does not stir them. Status leaves them cold. The endless pursuit of more that drives the machinery of civilization seems to them like children chasing soap bubbles. Beautiful perhaps, but ultimately empty. They have tasted enough of what the world calls success to know that it never delivers what it promises, that each achievement simply moves the finish line further into the distance, that the hunger for external validation is a thirst that no amount of recognition can quench. But do not mistake their disinterest for cynicism. They have not turned away from the world because they are bitter or broken. They have turned toward something deeper, something that makes the surface pleasures seem suddenly thin. They still appreciate beauty, still feel joy, still engage with life, but from a different center. They have found the spring that flows beneath all the decorated fountains, and having drunk from it, they cannot pretend that the colored water above tastes the same. Watch how they move through praise and criticism. The awake have lost their dependence on the opinions of others, not through arrogance, but through the hard-won discovery that no one else can tell you who you are. When you praise them, they do not puff up with pride. When you criticize them, they do not crumble with shame. They have learned to locate their worth somewhere beyond the fluctuating judgments of a world that changes its mind with every season. This makes them dangerous to systems that require compliance through approval and punishment. They cannot be controlled by the promise of acceptance or the threat of rejection because they have found a different ground to stand on. They speak rarely of their journey. While those newly awakening often feel compelled to announce their discoveries to everyone who will listen, the truly awake have learned the futility of such sharing. They know that what they have learned cannot be taught, only lived into. They know that their experiences, however profound to them, will sound like madness or arrogance or delusion to those who have not traveled the same inner terrain. So they keep their deepest knowings to themselves, like seeds buried in darkness, waiting for the rare moment when they encounter soil receptive enough to receive them. There is a loneliness that accompanies true awakening, and the awake carry it without complaint. They have learned that the price of seeing clearly is a certain kind of isolation, not chosen, but inevitable. They can no longer fully participate in the collective dreaming that binds most of humanity together. They can no longer pretend that
the emperor is wearing clothes when they can clearly see his nakedness. They can no longer join in conversations that feel to them like sleepwalkers discussing the nature of their shared dream while insisting they are wide awake. This does not make them superior. It simply makes them alone in a way that those still held by the collective cannot understand. And yet, within this loneliness, they have found a different kind of belonging. They have discovered that there is a fellowship of the awake that exists beyond geography and circumstance, a recognition that passes between souls who have traveled to the same depths. When two awakened beings meet, no words are necessary to confirm what they know of each other. There is a seeing that happens in silence, a mutual recognition of having been to the places where language fails and having returned with scars that mark them as kin. The truly awake have made peace with paradox. They have learned to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them, to embrace mystery without demanding it reveal itself as certainty. They can be simultaneously engaged with life and detached from its outcomes. They can care deeply about others while accepting they cannot save them. They can act with purpose while knowing that all purposes are ultimately invented. This comfort with paradox makes them incomprehensible to minds that still need everything to make logical sense, that still believe truth must be consistent and singular rather than multifaceted and fluid. Notice what they no longer need to prove. The awake have stopped trying to demonstrate their worth, their intelligence, their spiritual advancement, their superiority over those still sleeping. They have realized that all such demonstrations are simply the ego's last desperate attempt to maintain relevance, to convince itself that it exists, that it matters, that it is separate and special. They have touched something beyond the small self's endless hunger for validation, and in that touching, the need to prove anything to anyone has simply fallen away like dead leaves from a tree in autumn. They carry a strange kind of hope that has nothing to do with optimism. They have seen too much of human cruelty and cosmic indifference to believe that everything will work out fine, that love conquers all, that we are all ascending to higher dimensions of peace and light. They know the darkness intimately. They have shaken hands with despair and shared tea with nihilism. And yet beneath all the terrible clarity about what is, there lives in them a quiet faith in what could be, not as a promise, but as a possibility that depends entirely on whether enough humans choose to wake up before the collective dream becomes a collective nightmare. The truly awake do not separate themselves from the sleeping. They do not see two categories of humans, the enlightened and the ignorant, the conscious and the unconscious. They remember too clearly their own long slumber, their own resistance to waking, their own desperate clinging to comfortable illusions. They know that the line between sleeping and waking runs through every human heart, and that no one is ever fully one or the other. We are all, in their eyes, somewhere on the spectrum between dreaming and awakening, and the position we occupy today may not be the position we occupy tomorrow. What marks them most deeply is a kind of gentle sadness that never quite leaves their eyes. It is not depression or despair. It is the sorrow of seeing what could be while living in what is. It is the grief of watching humanity sabotage itself with astonishing consistency while possessing all the wisdom necessary to choose differently. It is the pain of being unable to reach through the dream and shake awake those you love, of having to watch them suffer in ways that seem so unnecessary, so preventable, if only they could see what you see. This sadness is not weakness. It is the inevitable consequence of caring deeply while seeing clearly. And yet they continue. This perhaps is their most remarkable quality. Despite the loneliness, despite the alienation, despite the heartbreak of watching the same patterns repeat endlessly, they continue to show up. They continue to offer their presence, their listening, their quiet testimony to another way of being. They do not do this because they believe they will change the world. They do this because it has become the only way they know how to live, because the alternative of returning to sleep is no longer available to them, because something in them refuses to pretend it does not see what it has seen. The soul recognizes itself across the distance of dreams. If these words touched something ancient in you, write,